Coast to coast, border to border, and around the world, it's time for The Bill Alexander Show. The Bill Alexander Show is a guest-driven program where the topics are diverse and entertaining. Laugh and learn while you listen to one of the best hours of online radio. Now, here's your host, Bill Alexander.
Good evening, everyone. Yours truly, William Eric Alexander. All my friends call me Bill, and I'm glad you could join us this evening on the Bill Alexander Show. Looking forward to tonight's conversation. We have a guest that we'll say is transgender, and she is going to be speaking to us about her life, what she does through TED Talks and everything like that. And we'll get underway here with Savannah Hauk. Savannah, how are you doing this evening?
Hey, Bill. I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing real good. Before we get started, can you explain to my audience who you are?
Okay. So I heard you kind of like, ooh, how should I call this person? Which is very common. So I will introduce myself. I am biologically male, assigned male at birth. I spend 90% of my life as a man, and the other 5 to 10% doing things like this with you, writing books, doing advocacy work, living a life that's feminine just for myself as well. I consider myself dual gender, non-transitioning. Okay. So I have no interest in, it's all part of the transgender spectrum, but I have no interest in transitioning in any medical, cosmetic, hormonal way. So I'm just happy to be in my body that I'm in, but express myself in both a male and female way.
Oh, okay. On your bio, it says that you've done TED Talks before. What were they about?
The first TEDx talk was about the fear of being me, the fear of being somebody like myself, and how do you overcome a lifetime of shame and repression and fear in a world that is still, as we all know, a little bit touchy about people like myself. So the first one was, how do you overcome that? So I told stories about who I am. I talked about advocacy, community, finding a place for yourself that you can grow and thrive in. And that's what I've done, which is ironic because I'm in South Carolina now. I came from New York and Detroit down to South Carolina the last couple of years. And down in South Carolina is where I found my advocacy and my voice and wanting to go out more so in the world. So the first TEDx was about that journey. And the second TEDx was more abstract, more about how anybody who meets anybody else takes 13 milliseconds for the brain to register what it feels about you before you actually consciously think you're making a decision about somebody. You've already scoped everybody out, whether they're a threat, whether they're not a threat, whether you like them, you don't like them, there's something wrong with them, something right with them. That all happens so subconsciously from your world experience view. It's very reptilian, it's very primal. And unfortunately, a lot of us, in all ways, stereotypes, me coming to the South and like having an expectation of what I was going to find down here, and somebody like myself being in this world down here, like what I expected people to think of me. And so we have all these preconceptions, and really what we need to work on is how to overcome that initial instinct to actually have a more rational, logical, compassionate, empathetic manner in which we approach people.
So how old were you when you realized that you were dual gender?
Well, by when I realized I was dual gender, that word didn't exist. But around the time I started understanding I was attracted to something different than just, boy clothes and just kind of being a male, was probably about 6, 7 years of age. So, and it just like slowly grew in little, no pun intended, baby steps from there, where I always kept it private, even from my parents and my family. And it wasn't until my mid-20s that I actually accepted the name or the label of crossdresser at the time, because that's the only word I kind of knew I fit with. Then now we hit the 2000s and the 2010s where the vernacular for gender diversity is becoming more mainstream and more words to describe. And that's where I realized, well, I'm transgender and I'm non-binary, but I consider myself dual gender because I have two very distinct presentation. One's very feminine, one's very masculine, and I'm not androgynous in any way. I'm not agender. I'm not kind of mixing and matching and being very androgynous like a David Bowie on stage. That's not really the
Right.
look I'm going for. I just want to be, I don't know, passable and seen in the world in the presentation I'm presenting as.
So the question I have is, are you heterosexual or are you homosexual? How does that work being transgender or dual gendered?
It's a great question because the assumption would be that I'm probably other than heterosexual, but I am
Mhm.
very much a heterosexual male. So I like women. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
It doesn't matter what the presentation is. I am attracted to women. If I want to be more finite about it, it is cis women primarily that are women who are biologically and genetically born female. That is my primary attraction. And what I found out in the 90s was that it's just because you're dressed as a woman and just because you see a man also dressed as a woman who's very attractive, the the irony is just because I was attracted to what I saw on the outside, that's actually very much exactly the way I would think and feel and how I'm attracted to a beautiful woman. Knowing
Mhm.
they're a man underneath was where my confusion came in. It's like, well, I know they're a man. I know they're a man under that, but they're so beautiful. So the attraction to the feminine was very logical for a heterosexual person like myself. It was about overcoming the nuance of like the knowing that's a drag queen and knowing it's another trans person and like kind of wrestling with that, thinking there was some homosexuality at play. But in reality, once you get past all of the facade, who do you want to spend your life with? Who do you want to take home to mom? And for me, that is a genetic woman.
So you said earlier in the interview you dress this way about 10% of the time and
Mm-hmm.
dress as a male about 90%. Where do you dress this way? Excuse me. Jeez.
Bless you. Typically, it's when I do conferences. It's usually Sundays is kind of my requisite time that both me and my girlfriend know that's Savannah Day. So on Sundays, if I'm feeling it, I'll go ahead and dress up for part of the day on Sunday. Uh, when I have conferences, like I have one coming up in Atlanta, the Atlanta Comfort Conference that I'm presenting at. I'll spend 2 or 3 days all day dressed as Savannah. And otherwise, it's just, the dribs and drabs of whenever I feel I need it or want it. And the rest of the
How
time,
did
it's just good old Chuck.
how did you introduce your girlfriend to Savannah?
Pretty much at the first kiss, like when I
Really?
realized this was taking a turn for the serious, I stopped what we were doing. I said, I really have to show you something. And this happens many times in many different ways for many of us, but always ends up trying to find that best picture of us, either on the phone, uh, a photo that's sitting in a shoebox, whatever it might be. We always find a way to say, this is also me. And then said, I am this person. And depending on how confident you are and comfortable and self assured about who you are as a person, that makes the conversation different. So for me, it's happened many times at many different comfort levels. But for Judy, my girlfriend, it was like, hey, by the way, I'm also this person. She's like, yeah, I know you dressed up as for Halloween. I said, no, 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 no. I'm also this person. Her name is Savannah. And I do this, part of the time. And it was kind of, mind melting. And we had to go through an adjustment period for her to even understand what it meant because she was not familiar with the community in that way.
So I'm sure the first question she asked you was why.
No, actually not. She didn't know what to ask me. Her
Oh,
first
okay.
question, one of the questions that was asked, typically there's 3 questions that are asked. One is, are you gay? The second is, oh, so you're a drag queen. And the third is, are you going to transition or do you plan to transition? And for me personally, no, no, and no. So I don't have plan to transition. I'm not glamorous enough to be a drag queen, and I have no interest in men. So that being said, the question of why, which you're asking all the right questions, I don't know why. No, but I don't think anybody knows why we do what we do. That would be like saying, why do you like football? Or why are you attracted to this and not that? It's just part of my genetic makeup that I am comfortable sharing with myself and with others. And there's many people who do not. There are many people who are in a closet and feel ashamed about who they are. For myself, I've done plenty of work over the last 30 years to just be very comfortable with this persona. And the whys are those intangibles that I don't think we'll ever know.
So you mentioned that you started doing this when you were 6, 7 years old, and you hid it from your parents. Do they now know that you are Savannah?
No, unfortunately, my father passed away. My mother has dementia, unfortunately.
Okay.
So sharing this would not be appropriate, nor there's no upside to it. Unfortunately, they're also very down about the queer community. They've always been very much vocal about their opposition to people in the queer community. So for me, there was no upside to sharing as a young person, nor as I became an adult. My sister knows, a couple of my cousins know, but all be told, I mean, few of my family members actually still know to this day.
Did your sister have a feeling that you were this way before you told her, or was it a
I don't
complete
think
surprise
so.
to her?
It seemed like a complete surprise. She never let on that it was, oh yeah, I knew there was something that was never spoken like that. She did send me a very lovely letter, typewritten letter back. This is in the 90s. Her and her husband both sent 2 letters very supportive of my journey. But we really never talked about it, honestly. And all the time that has passed, it's kind of like a known, but just not really spoken about. But no, there was no like, oh yeah, that explains a lot. That never came up in
Okay.
conversation. And when I tell new people, they also don't say, oh yeah, I knew there was something about you, because I present very heteronormative as a male. So this side is not like, I'm not super feminine when I'm presenting male. But the only thing I can tell you is I have a lot more empathy and compassion for people than maybe the typical jock or hunter or whatever stereotype you want to be all, throw some machismo on. And I'm just a little softer around the edges, I guess.
So I find it interesting that you referred to as being part of the queer community. Why would you say that if you're heterosexual, only you're dressing as a woman?
Well, the queer does not mean gay. Queer is just means some strange thing, not normative. So the queer community is the LGBTQIA plus community. It's all a big overlap. And as a transgender individual, I associate with the LGBTQ community. And if you want to if you don't want to keep stumbling over all the letters, it's really just a queer community.
Mhm. I find that interesting because I would have never put what you're doing in that same category. I don't know why, but I wouldn't put for some reason I wouldn't have done that. So you also host a podcast.
Yes.
And what is the podcast all about?
It is about well, first of all, it is me and my co-host Julie Rubenstein. We met on another podcast together. We were both paneling. And so she reached out to me and said, I would love to do something with you. And it morphed into a podcast. And the podcast is really my perspective about who I am and how I feel about the community. She comes at it from a female ally position who actually has a service that caters to trans women. So in that way, we both have familiarity from different points of view, and we just throw out topics every week. We're almost to episode 200. So that's a pretty big milestone for us after 5 years. And we just, whatever the topic of the day, whatever's top of mind, whatever's topical. Like, for instance, we just recorded an episode about the Olympics and about like kind of the trans mania that's going on with Amani Khalif and the boxer from Algeria. And just like, it just needed to be, we don't get super political and super in the weeds about those things, but it just was something that's so zeitgeist right now that kind of needed to be touched on.
With the way the political community is right now, how do you feel that people in your situation are going to be looked at depending on what happens in the next election cycle?
Is a very good question. I have a lot of fear. Now, I will say that I am a little bit removed from the resulting things that could happen based on who wins the election, because I don't need health care. because I'm not transitioning. I don't need same-sex equality for marriage because that's not me either. So there's a lot of things that don't apply to me, but there are certain things like bathroom bills, being arrested for just dressing a certain way. I could be arrested for dressing this way and being considered a drag queen, even though I'm not performing or doing anything but walking down the street. There's those type of things that could be, and that's at a state level. That's not even at the political, the national level. This is at the state level. So these are things that are happening now, regardless of the election cycle coming up in November. So in some ways, it's a little divorced from who I am and my worries and my needs. But as somebody who sees the community as a whole, is very unsettling to see like the where we are and what happens anytime you have a push for normalcy in any way. There's usually a massive pushback because people want things to stay the same. And until there's an education cycle, until there's a normalcy cycle, until people start realizing there are people around them that are in that minority that is being affected adversely, then you start seeing more growth versus more pushback. So I'd like to think that regardless of the election cycle, give it another decade, and this transness issue will be just like the gay issue from 20 years ago. It'll just kind of have its day, and people will move on, and things will be more normal, and not everybody will be about oppressing others whose opinion is different than their own.
The one thing I didn't think of, and you said Sunday is your Savannah day when you go out and do that. Have you ran into problems with going to the restroom, or do you find general neutral restrooms, or how do you do that?
Typically I go to Starbucks a lot, and I always have two bathrooms. Typically they're gender neutral anyway, so it doesn't matter. You use whichever one's available to you. In terms of going places, I went to North Carolina a few years ago for a writers conference because I also write. And I did have a concern for 10 seconds because I didn't know at the time if the bill had passed about what bathroom to use. So since I was dressed this way and it was early in the day and it was in a common space, I was like, well, I'm just going to use the women's room because this is where I feel I'd be less accosted versus going into the male's restroom and a bunch of guys are at a urinal wondering why there's a woman,
Right.
In their bathroom. So, when it comes to going to the bathroom, it's like everybody else in the world. We go in, we do our business, we wash our hands, we look at our face, touch up, and leave. There is few examples. And if there's more examples, please, anybody can come and give me the whole stats of convictions, arrests, of lurking people in bathrooms. Very rare do you hear any practical example of a gender diverse person without some sort of other mitigating mental illness, let's say, that is in a bathroom to cause some sort of situation.
What do you think because we've noticed in the last 7 years, we've noticed there's been much more of a hostile type environment for people that are in the queer community.
Yeah.
Prior to that, I don't want to say it was becoming normalized, but it wasn't as much talked about as it was in the past administration. What do you think caused this whole upheaval in the way society looked at it? Because originally, I think it has more to do with fear than it does anything else.
Oh, fear is always going to be the primary emotion that drives people to do what they do. If I want to give like just a very generic answer, I would say in the Obama administration, it was all about hope, all about bringing people together. There wasn't such, and also there was just an uptrend of understanding the language of the trans community and people in the community. So where you have that kind of unifying nature of an administration trying to pass laws that are inclusive and equality, same-sex marriage, national, bills and laws about that. When you have that, it all kind of comes up together, right? It's like you have an administration that's queer positive in that way. They're passing legislation to support that case. And then, unfortunately, I feel that when the Trump administration started, there was the repealing of what you did in the military. Like you couldn't be trans in the military. We weren't going to support that. Then there was more and more attacks about what trans is and what like you said, the fear of what this thing is and what it means to my lifestyle and my morality and everything about me. How does your living a life affect me? And I feel that people became more and more derisive about how somebody else's life was affecting their own life. Now, I understand that people have an opinion. Everybody's got an opinion, whether educated, ignorant, or either or both, that they feel a person is a certain thing. And if somebody looks at me down the street, Bill, you might have an impression about me, like I said, the 13 milliseconds to make an impression about who I am as a person. And that may not coincide with your worldview. That may be, I was brought up to think a certain way about these type of people.
Right.
Now, when you start boxing everybody into a certain type of person, there's a lot of fear that goes into that, not knowing what that means. And the unknown is scary. And the unknown leads to fear. And fear leads to trying to oppress the thing that you're afraid of, or get rid of it, or mitigate it, or put it away. And I think, long story short, I think that there was just a rise in both the visibility of people in the community and then kind of a rhetoric about there's something really wrong with those people in that community. Therefore, it kind of snowballed into a lot of just uneducation and people just looking at it all on face value. Again, I go back to Amani Khalif. Everybody thought that she was trans and it blew up and she shouldn't be fighting. Why is a man beating up a woman at the Olympics? And now all of a sudden everybody's backpedaling because all that was just bogus. Mm-hmm. And now they're like, oh, wait, I didn't realize. Yeah, you didn't realize because you didn't understand what gender means and like how the International Olympic Committee is not going to just like, go ahead, let her fight. It'll be fine.
Well, what I thought was interesting about the whole thing is that in this country, people thought our government should do something about it. And I'm thinking, this is in France. It's the International Olympic Committee doing it. We have no say.
No.
But yet they felt the need that we needed to put ourselves in the middle of the situation because they feel that they must feel they're right in some way, shape, or form. The more I hear you talk, I start realizing that certain generations are going to look at you differently.
Yes.
Have you noticed, and I'm noticing this because I have 3 kids, that my oldest is 24 years old, my youngest is 16. And when they talk about gender, they don't see gender, which I think is very interesting. I told my son that I had this interview and he came back and talked to me about what I was going to talk about and everything else. And I said, it all depends on what you wanted to talk about. And he would just ask me questions. He had no feeling whatsoever about it. He was just talking to me. So I'm noticing the millennials and the Gen Zs are more accepting than the boomers and the Gen Xers are, which I think is very interesting because if it wasn't for the boomers and Gen Xers, we wouldn't have the millennials and the Gen Zs. So where are they getting this different understanding about how gender works?
Well, first I'll say TikTok.
Okay.
TikTok and Reddit. When it comes to the dissemination of information, social media has been both the worst thing ever created and the best thing ever created. I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm that grind it out. I understood the world before the internet existed,
right?
Before we connected in that way. And I was also one of those people who thought I was very much alone because I didn't have anything other than periodicals in the library to figure out how do I fit into the fabric of society? Because I don't understand me any more than what I see on the news or on television shows or the movies. So what you're saying with your own children is a generation, and probably the second generation of, you have the pre-millennials, post-millennials, Gen Zs now, where they've had 20, 30 years to understand the nuances of what used to be a two-gender system. That's how you and I grew up. XX, XY, man, woman, that's it. Maybe if you want to really go deep diving, there's this thing called intersex that nobody talked about 40, 50 years ago, but it existed. And now kids are hearing about what agender is, what non-binary is. Like when we were kids, when I was a kid and we had all those people in high school that were the goths, all the people dressed up in long black trench coats and mascara. I mean, that was just our version of being androgynous and asexual and agender and kind of trying on what worked for us in that day and era. So the only difference is now there's just this vast spectrum galaxy of labels and titles and ideas that you and I never grew up with because we didn't have it at our fingertips at any given moment.
I didn't think of it until you started talking that when you, being a Gen Xer growing up, you really didn't have anything to look at or model yourself after, because anybody that was cross-dressing in the movies, it was Tootsie, it was Mrs. Doubtfire, it was comedians that were doing it to get a laugh.
Yes.
How did that make you feel as you were younger, that this was just a joke, or you were just confused?
I felt like it was a mockery. I felt it was something I couldn't understand because, yes, Tom Hanks and Booze and Buddies,
right?
Dustin Hoffman and Tootsie's, like they were doing what I'm doing and want to do. But like you said, it was either for a laugh. In the spectrum of the story, it was like, I needed to get a job because I can't get a job as a male. I need a place to live, and there's only this all-women's apartment building to get into. None of it made sense to me because they did it for a reason outside themselves, and I couldn't comprehend how that worked for me. Because for me, I did it for myself. There was no malice, there was no deception, I wasn't doing it to get ahead in some way. It was just to be me. So I didn't really see them as role models necessarily, because even though they were doing exactly what I was doing from a man dressed as a woman, man dressed as a woman, but the idea behind the why for them was so completely different than the why for me, is that I really never did associate, like you said, with them as role models, as I can understand what they're doing. That sounds like me. I appreciate it. I see myself in them. No, I didn't have that. So I always felt alone because, one, they weren't doing it for the same reason. And two, it always seemed, like you said, for a laugh and for mockery and for just a quick gag. So if I'm being used as a punchline, that's definitely not going to make me feel loved and warm and fuzzy.
Do you know, or is there a number of how many people that are cross-dressing nationally? I mean, is there a percentage? Do you know what it is that there are people doing it like you?
I don't have stats. I mean, I've heard different things. It depends on who you're talking about. And here's the thing: until we get to a point where everybody is super comfortable with their medical records. Like I've put non-binary on my medical records, so it doesn't say crossdresser; it just says non-binary. Like, because there's not a transgender on that form either for me to use. So until, one, there's kind of a universal understanding of what you can fit into in terms of gender. Two, when people are not in the closet and will deny it to their dying breath, where they don't want anybody to know that they're trans in any way, we're never going to get a full picture of the number of people in the community. I did see one stat that was very similar to the people who were left-handed stat. Because everybody says, oh my God, everybody's transgender now, and it's just going to keep skyrocketing. Now, the skyrocketing was never about there's more of us. It was all about we're more visible than we used to be.
Right.
And then, like, people who are left-handed, who were allowed to be left-handed. That's key. It's like everybody was forced to be right-handed in the 20th century up until like the 60s, right?
Yeah,
So
I'm
what
left-handed, so I'm able to be
there you go.
left-handed.
So there you go. So when people were allowed to be left-handed, you saw a spike. And then it plateaued because now everybody was like, oh, you're left-handed, whatever. So people started to be recognized as such, and then people normalized it. So I saw a very similar thing with transgender people where there's this massive spike that people are fearful about. Like, oh no, they're coming out of the woodworks. Everybody wants to be trans now. No, we're just confident enough to be heard as transgender, and then eventually will plateau as well. So, what percentage is that of the American tapestry? I don't know. It could be like redheads, 3% of the
Right.
population. It could be, I've heard like 4 out of 10 men have dressed in femme in some way or another, whether for a sexual encounter or to just as a lark. So there's 100 different stats, but until you get like a true measure, we're never going to know the full percentage. It's even in this country.
Are businesses and companies starting to cater to this population? Because where do you get your clothes from? Where do you get your makeup from? Where do you get all this at?
Oh, I get my clothes from where everybody else does.
Okay.
Macy's. I get them online. I go to Amazon. My makeup, I go to Sephora and Ulta. Even the other day, I was like, it's summery now, so I'm getting a little bit of a tan. Let me get them to kind of match my foundation again. I have no compunction going in as a man, not even dressed as a man, going in and say, "Hey, can you match my foundation again?" And I think that, to your point, there are some places like a Sephora or Ulta that is becoming more unisex and catering
Hmm.
to all genders and knowing that there's a market, knowing there's a need. And most people, if you go to Target or you go to Walmart or you go to Macy's or you go to Lord and Taylor's, at the end of the day, they just want to make a sale and get
Right.
stuff off the racks. So if it's me going to, where do we go? Dillard's in Asheville, and we're going to the clearance section, and I'm just trying on dresses as my male self with my girlfriend in tow to find a bunch of stuff. At the end of the day, some people might be like, no, you have to use a different fitting room because I don't want you in with the women, which I understand. That's their right to let everybody feel safe. And they'll open up another dressing room for us, and we'll try stuff fun, and we'll spend our money and add to the capitalism.
Oh,
But is everybody catering to the trans market or however you want to call it? I don't know. I think that capitalism is capitalism. I think some people who have more aptitude, like makeup, specifically makeup, there's a need and there's a want, and I
right.
think they recognize a market that's in need and it's only going to help them.
I find it interesting. You said you went in as your male self and looking at clothing. Do the sales clerks respond differently, or do they just say okay and just let you go? I mean, how do you interact with these people?
I will tell you this: the more confidence you have and more self assuredness you have in yourself as a person, like holding a dress that you want to try on,
Right.
then they are more apt to be. They'll just go on with it. It's like if you go in super timid and having really kind of low energy, negative energy, it also affects people and how they approach you and how they see you. So we had one time my co-host and my girlfriend and myself went into Ross Dress for Less. I was in male mode, but I kind of put in some shapewear underneath. I had my boobs in my hands in a
Mhm.
bag. And we had about 4 or 5 dresses. We went to the attendant, and it's like, oh, yeah, can we get a room that's big enough for all of us to be in? Because he needs to try these dresses on. And I'm like, yeah, and I brought my boobs. And she was so tickled. It's just like, oh, and she's like, touching them and like just having a good old time with us because
Uh-huh.
we didn't approach it in a weird
Right.
kind of skeezy way. We were just very upfront. It's like, this is what we're doing. We're trying this on. He's trying to dress this on for himself, and he brought his boobs, and here they are. Look, they look like boobs.
Mhm.
And she was just had a great time with it. So it's not the individual that typically has a problem with transgender people. It's the mob has the problem. It's the person who's the loudest on the far end of the rhetoric. So I have never had a bad experience in South Carolina, in the upstate of South Carolina, in my life in the last 6, 7 years. Every time I've gone out, it's been either people just don't even say anything to you, or they'll just smile because they're cordial and friendly, or
Right.
it's just been lovely. I've never had anybody looking at me sideways in a way that I felt unsafe.
That's interesting, especially in a southern state, which you feel accepted there, which I think is very interesting.
And before I moved here to South Carolina, I did feel that I was going to be unsafe.
And where was that at?
That was, like I said, coming down to the upstate of South Carolina, I felt the move here was going to
Oh,
be
I understand.
dangerous for
Right.
Savannah. And as soon as I got out there and started meeting people, I realized that my own assumptions and stereotypes of who I thought I would meet were purely unfounded too. So
So,
I'm not saying I'm going to biker bars at 3 a.m. I'm not saying
right.
that. But I mean, I do try to keep myself in safe locations and friendly locations. But everybody I have met has been very lovely.
So where you were living at before, I don't want to, was it more accepting or was it not an issue there?
Wasn't an issue. It's the boroughs of New York City, Long Island. As long as if you're in Nassau County, everybody's fairly accepting, and it's just kind of part of the fabric. But that being said, I didn't really go out in the daytime. I'd go to private events. I'd go to dinners with other couples like myself. But I never really spent time out in the daytime when I was in New York because I was just happy in my little bubble. So it wasn't until I came down to Greenville and Spartanburg and Asheville that I realized that there was a need for myself to be more visible and more vocal in
Okay.
who I am. And it's like I said, being down here, you would never expect it. If I said, "Hey, you know what the best thing to do for a crossdresser? Move to South Carolina." I would never have thought that would be the answer, but for me, it worked out just fine.
So you wrote a book, Living with Crossdressing.
Yes.
What is it? A guide on how to do it? What is the book all about?
Well, there's two in that series. One's Living with Crossdressing, Defining a New Normal, and that I wrote in New York with the help of some of those couples from those dinners I talked about, where their stories of partners and
Mhm.
how they deal with a male to female cross-dressing partner and a cis wife or girlfriend, and kind of like telling their stories from their perspectives. And it was also kind of a how-to, like it was almost like you could be a redneck if, it was kind of like you could be a cross-dresser if, and here's like 20 reasons why you could be and why you do it. The second book was um, Discovering Your True Identity, which is more of a how to, like, how do you find yourself in this vast arena of labels and boxes, and where do I fit and where do I go and what does it mean to me? So that's what the second book was really more the how to book. The first book was more the how to interact with a partner book. And then I just released Gender 101, a handbook, A to Z handbook and exploration, which is really demystifying what it means to talk about gender specifically.
Okay.
So it's about the XXXY. It's about chromosomal, diversity. It's about, the rest of the animal kingdom has gender diversity. Why do we think we're so special that we don't? They talk about intersex people. They talk about people who have hormones that don't have a carrier element to get all the testosterone in the world into your body because it just can't be carried through the body because there's a breakdown there. So you could be a man with only estrogen and look very female, but yet be a male. So there's all these, just this kaleidoscope of diversity in humanity that I think people just are unaware of because it's just never been talked about.
And I don't know if you do or not, but if you had a child, how would you explain this to them, or would you keep it from them until a certain age?
That is a very good question. And I have some experience because my previous girlfriend, she had a child that she was a guardian for. And she was very much, and we've been together for some time. And the guardianship happened later. And there was this idea where she was a little bit ashamed of me
Mhm.
And as a result, she did not want to expose the child with the type of person I was. So the point I'm making there is that it is a partnership. If you have two people, that have a child, there needs to be that common thread, that common united front about how you present this to a child. Personally, on a personal level, I think that it is such a normal part of the fabric of the society. And I have full confidence that if my child at 4 years old says, yeah, my daddy likes to dress as a girl, well, cat's out of the bag. Everybody who heard it now knows. And you have to
Right.
be confident and okay with that too. So there's security for yourself and your family. There is keeping your quote unquote secrets private. So letting a child know too early in life might get out there in the world. But if you come at it with confidence and self love and grace for yourself, then it really doesn't matter who knows, honestly.
We were talking briefly about the Olympics, and the big controversy was the opening ceremonies, which I'm watching it and I'm going, okay, um, I don't understand why people feel the need to get upset about something when it was just a presentation or an art form or something that was being presented on a national or an international scale, and yet there was a group of people that felt the need to be offended by it. Um, I don't understand why people get offended about by the things that they get offended by, because unless it's affecting you directly, you should just let it roll off your back and just keep on moving forward. But
I'm gonna give you both angles on this. Everybody's gonna be offended by something.
right.
Even me, even you, we would be offended by something. It's just a matter of, like you said, what do we do with that? Do we like go straight to Twitter and talk about the how dare they? Or we just like, oh, that happened. Okay, whatever. And we move on. So there are most of the population would just either not be offended or might be offended. And then are like, well, those weirdos in Paris, they really don't know what they're doing with these opening ceremonies. And then you got the people making these like, how dare they mock the Last Supper when it was not the Last Supper? It
Mm-hmm.
was the Feast of Dionysus or Dionysus. And the fact that we see something that looks very similar to what we think is ours, and to see it portrayed in a way that we don't appreciate. I understand the offending part of it. But it's just a matter of like, do we really need to make it this global catastrophe that happened when at the end of the day you're going to realize that's not what it was, and you're offended for really no reason other than your own feelings of being slighted.
The when that whole thing happened, my wife and I discussed it, and I never thought about this, but we're seeing a change in education where 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the education was much more well-rounded.
Mm-hmm.
You were learning Greek mythology, you were learning certain aspects of history and everything else, and it was more of an inclusive education. Not in the last 15 or 20 years has it become what it's become now. And it has become a situation where kids are learning from what their parents are saying or how they're imitating their parents. And do you see that changing back to the way it was 40 years ago, where it was a more inclusive environment, or do you see it getting more restrictive than what it is now?
I think for a while we're going to see it more restrictive, depending on where you live, depending on how many people decide to homeschool. I think COVID and the pandemic opened the eyes, and I'm going to say open, quote unquote, opened people's eyes to how they were understanding their child was being educated, and realizing, I guess you could say, they were offended by what they were being taught. Therefore, they wanted to change what their kid was being taught. Now, that's just one speculation. When I was a kid and I was in junior high school, I loved Greek, Roman, and Norse mythology. It was my favorite elective, as well as having algebra and botany and biology and English comp and all this stuff. I do feel that as much as I, make fun of my education growing up, I do feel like it was well rounded. I got to learn the things that were out there for me as elective or as requirements of the curriculum in junior high and high school. Not to say it was the best in public school necessarily, but I did feel like I had a really, like, I got to learn the things I wanted to learn. I couldn't even tell you what it's like out in the world today with education, but I do know that there is this push, and it's an audible visual push that we've seen on the news for a renewed interest in book banning, a renewed interest in, let's make sure we don't talk about slavery in a certain way and don't make white people feel bad about, being oppressors of this nation, whatever. And I don't understand why people take it such literally to heart in a negative fashion. Just because you learn how history is and learn the history of this nation and learn who were here before us and understand how people were pushed off their land so we could take it over, that doesn't mean that you did it. That just means you have empathy for what had happened and maybe you think differently about your place in the world. Not that it makes you less than, it just makes you more understanding of others and yourself. So I'm hoping will be a point that last statement I made becomes how the new generations are hearing and seeing. And you talked about your children, you talked about how they understand gender just in that conversation as if it's just normal. I'm hoping that with proper education, steered back to the right things to teach, and with the ability to have a social media structure where there is so much information out there, as long as and these kids are smart enough now that they're not just like saying, I read it, it's true. They're reading it, they're reading something else, and they understand how algorithms work and they understand what's being put in front of them. I think it's our generations that said, I saw it on TikTok and it means it's true because I read it 3 times in a row. Well, grandma, hate to tell you, but you know less now than you did a month ago. So I do believe there's going to be like that cliff, that plateau where the new generations, they understand the mechanics of information. And it's us old fuddy-duddies, the boomers, the Gen Xers, and even the greatest generation, who knows, that's been stymied by the allure of information without the understanding of how the information came to be.
Right. After 25 years, I recently retired from education, and I saw the handwritings on the wall, and it's not the students, it's the parents, and it's the school boards, and it's the way things are changing, that they're taking the education out of the teachers' hands and they're giving it to, I don't want to say the politicians, but I'll say the school boards. And the school boards think they know what best, even though the educators have had more education than most people will ever think of getting. And yet we're the bad guys in the situation. And unfortunately, after 25 years, I made the realization it was time to leave and time to go in a different direction, because it was just becoming so stifling that it was not what it was supposed to be.
Yeah, and that's a sad statement for somebody on the inside who just felt getting out was the only way out. And that's unfortunate. I know there's teachers out there still who are like, no, this is my profession. I don't want to abandon these kids. I want to give them what they need, but yet they're handcuffed,
right?
Because of the structure, the founding nature of who's in charge of those things.
So your podcast, how can people find it?
It's primarily it's on Apple, it's on Spotify. It's actually through podcasters for Spotify, and all pretty much most major streaming services. The Fox and the Phoenix airs every Wednesday, unless we're on hiatus, because it's a lot of work, as you know, to put a podcast together. The Fox and the Phoenix podcast you can find, like I said, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much anywhere else you throw that name in, or you should be able to find it.
So which one's the Fox and which one's the Phoenix?
Well, I don't know if you can see, but I have my little necklace here. I am the Phoenix of the pair, because her company is called Fox and Hanger, the service I spoke about earlier for Julie Rubenstein. And so she's always been the Fox. That's always been her animal companion. So yeah, somehow we we put like your chocolate's in my peanut butter and your peanut butter's in my chocolate, and somehow the name just happened and worked. And yeah, so I am the phoenix. I am the one rising from the ashes to become something new.
Savannah, before I let you go, is there anything you want to tell my audience?
I would love to tell your audience to keep listening to you, number one, first and foremost. And if I could say anything other than find me on social media, Savannah Hauk on Facebook and on Instagram. Yeah, please, if you have any interest in knowing more about the community, feel free to ask whoever it may be that's around you. Like, I always love answering questions when I'm out and about. And there's no wrong way to ask as long as you come with kind intention and interest. And people will very much want to talk to you and kind of fill you in with their stories. And sometimes the best way to educate yourself is just to hear somebody else's story.
Well, Savannah, thank you very much for joining me this evening. I enjoyed it. And hopefully we can do this again sometime.
It'd be fantastic. Thank you for having me on.
A big thank you goes out to Savannah Hauk for joining me this evening. What a pleasure it was to talk to her. Don't forget to check out her podcast, The Fox and the Phoenix, available where you get all your podcasts. And thank you very much for being part of the program this evening here on The Bill Alexander Show. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to The Bill Alexander Show. The Bill Alexander Show is a $1 Million Baby production. For more information, go to thebillalexandershow.com.